It was supposed to be just another routine flight, the kind that the CEO had taken countless times before, but as soon as he stepped onto the plane, the air felt different, charged with an unspoken tension that he immediately sensed. There was no announcement, no overt warning, nothing to indicate that this day would be any different from all the others, yet the very moment he entered, the subtle glances, the quiet whispers, and the hurried adjustments of staff made him aware that something was about to unfold. He moved with his usual confidence, a man accustomed to the highest levels of respect and recognition, carrying himself with the poise of someone who had spent years building an empire from scratch. His presence alone usually commanded attention, a silent acknowledgement of his status and achievements, but today, he realized, the recognition he was used to receiving was conspicuously absent. As he approached the first-class section, his ticket and credentials in hand, the flight attendant glanced at him in a way that was almost imperceptibly dismissive. He noticed it immediately, the slight hesitation, the almost imperceptible shift of her eyes away from his face, and the mechanical way she addressed him as though reading from a script she didn't particularly care to follow. There was a coldness there that he had not anticipated, a subtle yet cutting barrier erected in the space between him and the comfort that he had already paid for and rightfully earned. It was not just service, it was a statement, a quiet, public dismissal of his presence. He could feel the weight of it, a heavy tension that pressed down not only on him but on the environment around him, altering the atmosphere of what should have been a neutral, ordinary flight experience. The humiliation began not with words but with actions. The seat that had been assigned to him, confirmed weeks in advance, was now suddenly a source of dispute. The flight attendant, with practiced politeness that masked her condescension, suggested that there had been a mistake and that he would need to relocate. His initial response was calm, a measured inquiry, but the air of incredulity surrounding him was unmistakable. Passengers nearby began to notice the interaction, some with curiosity, some with discomfort, and others with that subtle, internal judgment that people reserve for situations they do not fully understand but feel compelled to comment on mentally. The CEO, aware of every look and whisper, maintained his composure, yet internally, a storm was brewing. He had never encountered such blatant disregard before, and it struck him sharply, cutting deeper because it was entirely unnecessary and entirely personal in its execution. The whispers grew louder, as if the very act of dismissing him required audience validation. The attendant's tone carried a double message, politeness, yes, but loaded with an underlying assumption that he would comply without question. The CEO's identity, accomplishments, and stature meant nothing in that moment. He was reduced to a perception, a stereotype, a person to be moved aside for reasons that were never explicitly stated but were unmistakably clear. Every word that followed, every gesture, every mechanical motion of the staff reinforced a narrative he did not deserve. The irony of the situation was palpable. Here was a man who had achieved so much, whose influence extended across industries and continents, being treated as though his very presence was inconvenient, almost unwelcome. Humiliation, when it arrives in such a direct and public form, is insidious. It does not merely insult the individual, it seeps into the space, affecting everyone who witnesses it. Fellow passengers felt the tension, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others pretending not to notice, while a few discreetly filmed snippets on their phones, capturing what they perceived as an unusual incident. The CEO, ever observant, noted every detail, the way the attendant's eyes flickered to a passenger in a seat nearby, the way her posture stiffened when she realized he was watching closely, and the faint but unmistakable smirk of someone convinced of their own authority. The indignity was heightened by the public nature of the act. This was not a private confrontation that could be handled quietly or internally, it was on display, visible to everyone, a spectacle engineered not out of necessity but out of prejudice. He tried, as anyone in his position might, to defuse the situation calmly, speaking politely, asking for clarification, attempting to assert his rightful position without raising his voice. But every effort seemed to be met with subtle resistance, a polite yet firm denial, a way to remind him that, in this microcosm of authority, he was not in control. The experience, while brief in duration, felt prolonged, a drawn-out exercise in testing patience and composure. He became acutely aware of the psychological mechanics at play, recognizing the humiliation for what it was, a display of power, or rather, a misuse of perceived power, designed to belittle, unsettle, and destabilize him. In that moment, the CEO felt the full weight of social dynamics and prejudice converge on him. The seat was no longer just a seat, it had become a symbol of entitlement, of respect denied, of status questioned. Each movement, each spoken word, each exchanged glance contributed to a growing narrative that positioned him as an outsider, someone to be sidelined, even in a space he had every right to occupy. And yet, beneath the layers of indignity and insult, there was an ember of something far more enduring, a spark of resolve, a realization that humiliation, no matter how public or humiliating, could be transformed into leverage, strategy, and ultimately, triumph. The moment it became clear that this was no ordinary inconvenience, the CEO began to notice the layers of discrimination and disrespect that were unfolding around him. It wasn't a single, overt act that marked the incident, it was the accumulation of subtle gestures, unspoken assumptions, and dismissive behaviors that made the environment increasingly hostile. The flight attendant's tone, the body language, the careful avoidance of eye contact, all combined to communicate a message: you do not belong here, and your presence is inconvenient. It was discrimination in its most insidious form, quiet, polished, and almost invisible to those not paying close attention, but crystal clear to its target. The CEO, someone deeply attuned to human behavior, recognized it immediately, the discomfort settling into his chest like a cold, hard weight. As the boarding continued, he noticed the way other passengers, seemingly unaware of the full context, subtly shifted their gaze toward him. Some offered polite smiles, others avoided eye contact entirely, and a few whispered to one another, their words intentionally vague but loaded with assumptions. It was as if they were trying to make sense of an incident they could not name, yet they felt compelled to comment on. In this environment, he realized, his status, achievements, and identity were being undermined by the implicit biases of those around him. The subtle humiliation was compounded by a public awareness, every small act of disrespect was witnessed and, in some ways, validated by the audience of fellow passengers. He could feel the invisible pressure of societal expectations pressing down, as though he were being tested, his reaction scrutinized, his dignity measured against an unspoken standard of compliance. The flight attendant, meanwhile, continued her performance of courteous professionalism, but her actions betrayed an undercurrent of disdain. Every instruction she offered was delivered with a mechanical precision that emphasized her control over the situation. She asked for identification, confirmed seating, and repeated directives, all in a tone that suggested he should accept the changes without objection. The careful politeness was a tool of power, wielded with the intent to communicate that questioning or challenging the authority in this space was inappropriate. Each word, each gesture, each careful glance was designed to reinforce the notion that he was an outsider, that he was somehow less deserving, that he should accept the minor indignities as part of his place on this flight. It was subtle, but the CEO recognized it instantly. The language of discrimination does not always need to be explicit to be felt, and today, it was being communicated in every interaction. It was not only the flight attendant who contributed to the atmosphere of disrespect. Other staff members, though less directly involved, mirrored the behavior in small, almost imperceptible ways. A delayed response to his requests, a quick, dismissive nod, a faint tightening of the jaw when he approached, they were minor gestures, almost invisible individually, yet together they formed a pattern. This pattern, he realized, was deliberate, conscious or not, and spoke to a systemic failure to recognize and honor the humanity and achievements of certain individuals based on appearance alone. The CEO, despite years of navigating corporate hierarchies and dealing with high-pressure situations, found himself in a position where the social script was being rewritten around him, casting him in a role he had never auditioned for, the person who was less, who must yield to those perceived as more deserving. He also noticed the reactions of other passengers. Some offered sympathetic looks, their subtle nods or quiet murmurs hinting that they recognized the injustice but felt powerless to intervene. Others avoided engagement entirely, eyes glued to books or devices, pretending nothing unusual was happening. And yet, some carried an air of judgment, as though silently questioning why he did not immediately accept the slight, why he dared to occupy a space that had been subtly but unmistakably denied to him. The CEO understood the psychology at play. Humans are quick to internalize social hierarchies, to observe and judge without fully understanding context. He observed these behaviors carefully, mentally cataloging the nuances, knowing that they would all factor into the unfolding of what he intended to do next. Discrimination, he realized, is most effective when it is masked as routine or fairness. By framing the denial of his seat and the subtle disrespect as a clerical error, a procedural oversight, or a minor inconvenience, the flight staff attempted to avoid accountability. The intent, however, was clear. A message had been sent, and it was intended to diminish his presence, question his right to occupy this space, and reinforce biases that went beyond a single interaction. The CEO, with all his experience, understood that true power lies in recognizing these patterns, in observing the behavior without immediate reaction, and in preparing a response that would shift the balance, restore dignity, and expose the superficiality of the prejudice. The indignities, though subtle, accumulated rapidly. Each delay, each carefully phrased instruction, each glance of hesitation built a narrative of exclusion. The CEO felt the tension tighten around him like an invisible cage, designed to make him question his place, to provoke a response that could be misconstrued as overreaction. And yet, he maintained composure, aware that the moment required more than emotion, it demanded observation, strategy, and an understanding of the psychological weight that discrimination carries. In this environment, every action would be noted, every reaction analyzed, and the eventual response would have to be measured, deliberate, and unmistakably powerful. The initial moment when the CEO realized he was being publicly disrespected was a jolt, a sudden recognition that something entirely unfair and unexpected was unfolding. Anger surged almost immediately, a natural response to being treated in a way that undermined his dignity and authority. It was not the reckless, uncontrolled anger of someone unprepared, but a focused, simmering intensity that radiated from a deep place of experience and self-awareness. Years of navigating high-stakes business negotiations and commanding rooms full of influential people had taught him that raw emotion, if unchecked, could be a liability. Yet, even with that knowledge, the initial spark of outrage was undeniable, a visceral response to a blatant injustice that he could neither ignore nor excuse. He felt the heat of indignation rise, a pulse that seemed to echo in his chest, and for a moment, the world around him narrowed to the immediate injustice of the situation. Disbelief accompanied the anger, a sense that this could not possibly be happening in the way it was. He had flown countless times before, seated among diverse groups of passengers, and had never encountered such blatant disrespect or exclusion. Yet here it was, undeniable and present, enacted in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. The cognitive dissonance was striking. He had to reconcile his understanding of the world, of how society and institutions were supposed to operate, with the reality unfolding in front of him. Every glance from the staff, every whisper from nearby passengers, every mechanical gesture of dismissal compounded the disbelief. He found himself momentarily frozen, as if trying to parse the scenario, to understand whether this was a single error, a mistake born of negligence, or a deliberate act of discrimination designed to provoke a reaction. Restraint, however, quickly followed. Though anger and disbelief burned intensely within him, the CEO recognized that responding impulsively would only serve to escalate the situation in ways that were unproductive and potentially damaging. He understood that control, even in moments of profound insult, was a form of power in itself. Restraint was not weakness, it was a tactical decision, a conscious choice to hold back immediate reactions and allow thought, strategy, and observation to guide the next move. The challenge was immense, to manage the physical and emotional responses while being acutely aware that he was under the scrutiny of both staff and fellow passengers. Every muscle, every facial expression, and every tone of voice had to be controlled to avoid revealing the depth of his initial emotional reaction while simultaneously preparing for a more calculated response. The CEO's mind began racing, cataloging every detail of the situation, the tone of the flight attendant, the timing of her words, the subtle cues of other staff, the reactions of passengers near him. He noticed the way a couple of nearby travelers shifted uncomfortably, the faint glances of judgment, and the hurried adjustments of personal items as if trying to avoid being caught in the tension. Each observation was another data point, feeding a mental framework that would later inform his response. While the world around him seemed designed to provoke a rash reaction, he cultivated an internal calm, a quiet, controlled awareness that allowed him to separate the emotional impact from the strategic considerations. It was a delicate balance, maintaining composure in the face of disrespect while also recognizing the need to act decisively when the moment presented itself. Anger, however, was not entirely suppressed. It simmered beneath the surface, coiled and ready to be directed with precision. The CEO understood that anger could be a tool if wielded properly, a source of energy and focus rather than a reaction that clouds judgment. He allowed himself brief moments to feel it fully, acknowledging the injustice without permitting it to dictate his immediate behavior. The intensity of the emotion sharpened his awareness, heightened his sensitivity to the dynamics around him, and clarified the stakes of the situation. He knew that every micro-movement, every word exchanged, and every interaction could either reinforce the humiliation he was experiencing or set the stage for a reversal that would reclaim his dignity and assert his authority. Disbelief, too, played a role in shaping his strategy. By recognizing how surreal and unreasonable the situation was, he gained a mental advantage. The absurdity of being publicly shamed despite his accomplishments, wealth, and status highlighted the pettiness and bias of those who were orchestrating the humiliation. Understanding the irrationality of the behavior around him allowed him to mentally detach from the personal sting and view the incident analytically. He began to see patterns, predict potential responses from the staff, and consider the broader social context in which the disrespect was occurring. It became clear that a careful, deliberate approach would be far more effective than immediate confrontation or emotional retaliation. Restraint, in combination with awareness, became the guiding principle. The CEO adopted a calm exterior, projecting neutrality and measured confidence while internally preparing for the move that would ultimately reverse the power dynamics. He controlled his breathing, maintained steady eye contact when appropriate, and used subtle body language to convey dignity and composure, refusing to allow the staff's discriminatory behavior to force him into a defensive posture. Each moment of restraint was a silent assertion of control, a refusal to be manipulated by the superficial display of authority and bias. Throughout this initial period, the CEO experienced a complex blend of emotions, the sting of disrespect, the flash of anger, the astonishment of disbelief, and the disciplined control of restraint. These reactions did not exist in isolation, they intertwined, informing his understanding of the environment and his potential strategies. He was acutely aware that the stakes were not merely personal but also symbolic, representing broader issues of respect, recognition, and equality. As he navigated the first moments of humiliation, the balance of emotion and reason began to shape the path forward, preparing him for the decisive action that would soon follow. After the initial shock of humiliation and the surge of anger began to subside, the CEO's mind shifted into its natural mode of calculation and strategy. He understood instinctively that responding impulsively could backfire, potentially escalating the situation in ways that would leave him further exposed rather than restoring his dignity. Instead, he focused on observing, analyzing, and formulating a response that would not only address the disrespect but also transform it into a decisive advantage. This was a man whose professional life had been built on foresight, anticipating moves in boardrooms, negotiating billion-dollar deals, and turning seemingly disadvantageous positions into opportunities for triumph. Now, on this plane, he applied the same analytical rigor, viewing the insult not as a personal affront to be fought with raw emotion but as a challenge to be navigated with intelligence and precision. He began by cataloging every factor that could influence the outcome. The flight attendant's behavior, though outwardly polite, contained numerous telltale signs of condescension and subtle bias, and he took note of her patterns, the way she positioned herself, the tone of her voice, the selective attentiveness with which she responded to other passengers. He also observed the reactions of nearby travelers, noting who seemed sympathetic, who appeared indifferent, and who might act as witnesses or amplifiers to any confrontation or display. Each piece of information became part of a larger mental map, a landscape of leverage and opportunity that he could exploit when the moment was right. The CEO recognized that a carefully executed response could shift the power dynamics entirely, turning the tables not just for himself but also making a broader statement about respect, authority, and the consequences of underestimating him. While considering options, he reflected on the nature of public perception and social dynamics. In these moments, perception often matters as much as reality. A reaction fueled purely by anger might satisfy the immediate emotional need for justice, but it would lack the long-term impact, the ability to reshape the narrative and leave a lasting impression. The key was subtlety, precision, and timing, a move that appeared effortless yet carried unmistakable weight. He began to weigh potential strategies: confrontation, appeal to authority, or a silent assertion of dominance that would reveal the pettiness of the staff's actions without requiring overt conflict. Each possibility was scrutinized, measured against its potential to achieve not just satisfaction but undeniable, visible vindication. The CEO's strategy began to take shape around one fundamental principle: leverage the element of surprise. He understood that those who sought to humiliate him expected predictable responses: shock, protest, or visible discomfort. By suppressing the expected reaction, he could unsettle them, create an opening, and assert control in a way they would not anticipate. This required patience, restraint, and a careful reading of the social environment, ensuring that his actions would carry maximum psychological impact. The plan was not about revenge in a conventional sense, it was about reclaiming power, dignity, and authority in a manner that would be undeniable to everyone present. He also considered the symbolic dimension of his response. The slight he had experienced was not just personal, it was emblematic of broader societal biases and microaggressions that many individuals face daily. By crafting a response that was clever, composed, and decisive, he could transform a moment of personal indignity into a demonstration of intelligence, poise, and strategic acumen. The act itself would become a statement, a lesson not just for the staff involved but for anyone observing, proving that attempts to belittle or undermine him would be met with precision and mastery rather than chaos or capitulation. Part of the strategic calculus involved understanding timing. The CEO recognized that immediate confrontation might provoke defensiveness or resistance, diluting the impact of any corrective action. He needed a moment when the social and physical environment was aligned for maximum effect, a time when the staff's attention, the passenger's gaze, and the unfolding sequence of events could all be harnessed to underscore his response. Timing was everything. A misstep could trivialize the effort, but a well-executed maneuver would turn an embarrassing moment into an undeniable display of authority. In addition to timing, he considered optics and presentation. The move had to be executed with such calm confidence that it appeared effortless, natural, and justified. Every gesture, every expression, and every word had to reinforce the narrative that he was in control, that the disrespect was not only acknowledged but also met with a solution that was both intellectually satisfying and socially resonant. He visualized how the sequence would unfold in the minds of the observers, the realization of the staff, the silent acknowledgement of bystanders, and the inevitable recalibration of power dynamics that would follow. It was not enough to assert authority privately, the impact had to be public, undeniable, and complete. While the plan was taking shape in his mind, the CEO also rehearsed contingencies. Human behavior is unpredictable, and the reactions of the staff or passengers could introduce unexpected variables. By anticipating these possibilities, he ensured that his strategy would remain robust under pressure. Every potential interruption, deflection, or attempt to undermine him was considered and incorporated into a flexible mental blueprint, allowing him to adapt seamlessly while maintaining the overarching goal of dignity, authority, and visible victory. In this mental space, the CEO experienced a transformation. The initial sting of disrespect began to fade, replaced by the excitement and focus of strategic execution. Anger, disbelief, and humiliation were converted into clarity, precision, and the anticipation of a calculated move that would shift the narrative entirely. He recognized the rare opportunity before him, the chance not only to reclaim his seat and assert his presence but also to craft a story that would resonate far beyond the confines of the airplane, illustrating the power of intelligence, patience, and strategic action in the face of injustice. With a clear plan in mind, the CEO prepared to execute the move that would redefine the dynamic of the flight, reclaim his authority, and make a statement that would resonate far beyond the cabin. Every detail mattered, from posture to timing to the precise tone of voice. He understood that the effectiveness of his action would depend not only on the move itself but on the environment and the reactions of those around him. The flight attendant, confident in her assumption of control, remained unaware of the mental calculation taking place in front of her. She believed she had dictated the rules, that the slight inconvenience she had engineered would pass without consequence. The CEO, however, had been observing every nuance, every gesture, every flicker of expression, and had chosen the perfect moment to act, a moment when her attention was divided, the passengers' curiosity piqued, and the cabin's atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. He began with a subtle adjustment, a shift in his demeanor that projected calm confidence while masking the intensity of his focus. His body language spoke of control and composure, signaling to everyone present that he was not to be underestimated. Each movement was deliberate, measured, and slow enough to command attention without seeming forced. The passengers, sensing a change in energy, began to notice, their eyes subtly shifting toward him, curious and anticipating. The flight attendant, on the other hand, remained initially unaware that the balance of power was about to shift. Her previous sense of authority, built on the assumption of compliance, was about to be challenged in a manner that she could neither predict nor counter. The CEO then engaged with the social and procedural rules of the environment, using them to his advantage. He spoke with clarity, authority, and a calm that belied the tension in the cabin. Every word was chosen to assert correctness and rightful claim without raising his voice or appearing aggressive. He framed his position not as a confrontation but as a natural, logical conclusion to the events that had unfolded. By appealing to principles of fairness, procedure, and professionalism, he removed the subjective element of personal bias from the interaction, forcing the situation to align with objective standards. This approach was subtle yet powerful, because it left the flight attendant with no obvious avenue of resistance without exposing her own misjudgment. As he continued, the CEO used the reactions of the passengers as an amplification tool. Their attention, now drawn fully to the unfolding scene, added social pressure that reinforced his position. The murmurs of acknowledgement, the curious glances, and the quiet realization that an injustice was being addressed all contributed to a psychological environment in which his authority was naturally elevated. By executing his move in public, he leveraged the implicit power of observation, turning witnesses into allies of perception. The effect was cumulative, reinforcing the impact of every action he took, magnifying the consequences of the staff's previous disrespect without requiring any overt aggression on his part. The move reached its apex when the CEO introduced an element of strategic surprise. He executed a gesture, statement, or action, precisely calibrated to maximize impact, that immediately shifted the dynamic in his favor. The timing was impeccable. He had waited until the peak moment of tension, when curiosity, judgment, and expectation were at their height. The flight attendant, caught off guard, was momentarily stunned, realizing too late that her assumption of control had been misplaced. Her authority, which she had exercised with confidence and condescension, was effectively neutralized in an instant, replaced by an acknowledgement of the CEO's rightful presence and the respect that had been denied to him moments earlier. In addition to timing, the CEO's mastery of psychological leverage played a critical role. By maintaining calm and precision throughout, he ensured that his move carried maximum social and emotional weight. The subtle yet undeniable demonstration of control, fairness, and composure left the staff with little room to counter without further exposing their errors. It was a lesson executed with intelligence rather than force, showing that true authority often lies not in confrontation but in the ability to orchestrate outcomes in a way that highlights competence, confidence, and foresight. Passengers reacted almost immediately to the shift in dynamics. Some offered discreet nods, impressed by the quiet assertiveness of the CEO. Others exchanged looks of surprise, acknowledging the brilliance of the maneuver without fully understanding the premeditated strategy behind it. The cabin, previously tense with uncertainty and discomfort, shifted into an atmosphere of respect and realization. Observers could sense that a subtle, yet decisive, correction had taken place, a single action that altered the perception of authority, fairness, and competence in the space. The CEO had not only reclaimed his seat but also transformed the entire situation into a demonstration of strategic brilliance, commanding respect in a manner that was impossible to ignore. Every aspect of the move was executed with an eye toward long-term impact. It was not merely about immediate vindication, it was about setting a precedent, demonstrating that attempts at discrimination, disrespect, or dismissal would not go unchallenged when met with intelligence, patience, and precision. The flight attendant, now confronted with the undeniable shift in power, was forced to recalibrate her behavior, recognize the error, and accommodate the rightful authority of the CEO. The action had been executed so skillfully that it left a lasting impression on the entire cabin, a visible lesson in dignity, strategy, and consequence. Throughout the execution, the CEO remained composed, fully aware of the importance of perception and optics. Every movement, every tone, every glance was part of a larger narrative, one that he had meticulously crafted in his mind from the moment the disrespect began. The elegance of the action lay in its simplicity, a single, well-timed, perfectly executed move that communicated authority, corrected injustice, and left the observers with no doubt as to the intelligence, capability, and presence of the individual at the center of the storm. The aftermath of the CEO's decisive move unfolded with a clarity and precision that mirrored the strategy he had employed throughout the incident. The flight, which had been tense, uncomfortable, and charged with subtle hostility, began to settle into a new equilibrium, one defined not by the earlier disrespect but by the unmistakable assertion of authority and dignity that had transformed the situation. Passengers, previously silent observers of an injustice, now became witnesses to the full extent of the CEO's mastery, both of the environment and of the human dynamics at play. The shift was almost immediate, subtle nods of recognition, quiet murmurs of acknowledgement, and a perceptible sense of relief among those who had sensed the tension and discomfort that had pervaded the cabin. It was as though the entire social atmosphere had been recalibrated, and in that recalibration, the CEO's presence and authority were no longer questioned but recognized and affirmed. The flight attendant, who had been the instrument of the initial slight, was visibly affected. Her demeanor changed, subtly at first, as the reality of the situation settled in. The carefully maintained aura of authority that she had relied upon crumbled under the weight of the CEO's strategic execution. There was no need for her to speak. The acknowledgement of error, of the misjudgment she had made in attempting to sideline him, was evident in her posture, her eyes, and the hesitant movements that suggested she understood the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. What had begun as a challenge to his authority had been transformed into a lesson, one that she could not deny, one that carried a weight far beyond the immediate interaction. The CEO had ensured that justice was not a matter of confrontation but of undeniable demonstration. Other passengers, too, played a role in reinforcing the aftermath. The initial curiosity that had bordered on voyeuristic interest evolved into admiration and recognition. Those who had been skeptical or indifferent now witnessed the competence, poise, and calculated intelligence that had guided the CEO's actions. Conversations that had been whispered in uncertainty became nods of affirmation and subtle comments of respect, spreading through the cabin in a quiet acknowledgement of the order restored and the lesson delivered. In these reactions, the CEO observed a broader principle at work, that public perception can be as influential as private victory, and that reclaiming respect in a visible, measured way can resonate more powerfully than any private satisfaction ever could. The psychological impact on the staff extended beyond the immediate flight. The flight attendant's colleagues, who had observed the interaction from a distance, could not ignore the shift in dynamics. The lesson was multifaceted: respect cannot be assumed, authority cannot be disregarded based on superficial judgments, and attempts to undermine someone's dignity carry consequences that extend beyond the personal moment. This subtle yet profound teaching reinforced broader social norms, demonstrating that strategic intelligence, patience, and controlled execution are powerful tools for asserting justice in environments where bias or prejudice may surface. It was a demonstration that power exercised with intelligence and foresight carries far more weight than power exercised through arrogance or assumption. The CEO himself experienced a range of emotions in the aftermath, though they were tempered by the professionalism and strategic mindset that had guided his actions. Satisfaction was present, of course, a deep and resonant acknowledgement that the injustice had been corrected and that the dignity which had been challenged was fully restored. Yet there was also a measured awareness of the broader implications, a recognition that this single event, while deeply personal, reflected larger social dynamics and the ongoing challenges faced by individuals in positions of influence and prominence. He understood that his actions had provided not only personal vindication but also a demonstration of resilience, strategic thinking, and the importance of measured response in the face of discrimination. The impact extended beyond immediate social circles, reaching into a conceptual understanding of respect and authority. By executing his strategy so flawlessly, the CEO illustrated that challenges to dignity can be confronted not through brute force, aggression, or reactive anger, but through intelligence, timing, and the careful orchestration of human perception. The event became, in essence, a teaching moment, showing that social equilibrium, when disrupted by prejudice, can be restored with strategic finesse, and that public demonstrations of competence and fairness carry a resonance that private actions cannot match. The lessons embedded in the aftermath were clear: recognition, respect, and authority are not merely granted, they are maintained, asserted, and, when necessary, reclaimed through deliberate and intelligent action. Furthermore, the CEO's handling of the situation emphasized the importance of patience and observation in achieving justice. By resisting the immediate urge to confront or react in anger, he created the conditions necessary for a response that was both proportionate and unforgettable. His patience allowed him to gather intelligence, read the environment, and select the precise moment when the execution of his move would carry maximum effect. This methodical approach highlighted the value of strategic foresight in dealing with complex social interactions, particularly when bias or discrimination is involved. In the broader context, the aftermath served as a subtle but powerful critique of systemic behavior. The initial disrespect had been rooted in assumptions, superficial judgments, and an underestimation of capability. By reversing the situation so completely, the CEO not only reclaimed his dignity but also exposed the fallacy of these assumptions. Observers, both direct and indirect, were forced to reassess their perceptions, to recognize the consequences of disrespect, and to acknowledge the authority, intelligence, and strategic acumen of an individual who had been unjustly marginalized. The correction was not loud or aggressive, it was methodical, undeniable, and socially resonant, leaving a lasting impression on all who had witnessed it. In the end, the aftermath was a combination of restored respect, broader social teaching, and personal satisfaction. The CEO had not only navigated a deeply uncomfortable and humiliating situation but had also transformed it into an opportunity to demonstrate the power of strategic action, intelligence, and composure. The consequences for those who had attempted to undermine him were immediate and undeniable, illustrating that attempts to belittle, dismiss, or marginalize an individual can be met with responses that are both elegant and irrevocable. The cabin, once tense with uncertainty and subtle hostility, now carried an unmistakable tone of acknowledgement, respect, and recalibrated social balance.